Chair, you mentioned at the beginning of the meeting the length of time that we spent talking the last time when you were in Miss Talon, and I'll take full blame and responsibility for that because we went over at some detail the Poolbeg Incinerator at the time, and I hope to not take too long on the issue today. I'll be as brief as possible to address that, but we did get some very interesting documentation during the week and actually in the months since you came in before us. I'd like to go through a bit of that now, if I may. Chair, we talked about value for money a lot so far today, and I think an important part of the work that this committee can do is in relation to value for money reports and how they're actually conducted within the civil service and within the public sector so that we can be confident in them. I mean, in relation to the Poolbeg Incinerator, in 2005 a value for money survey was done. At that point 27 million had been spent on the project and nothing had been built, and yet it was confirmed that this project was value for money. 2 years later, in 2007, another value for money report was done. A further 22.5 million had been spent and still nothing was built, but still the project was seen as value for money. That was 50 million or thereabouts in 2007. I think that value for money audit was done by the NDFA, and I don't know, Chair, if we'll have an opportunity to have the NDFA in front of us. Next week they'll be in. Well, then I'll take that up with them at the time as to how we actually do those value for money reports, because that's, I think, astonishing. For about a decade, though, in relation to the Poolbeg Incinerator, Ms. Fallon, people and public representatives have been questioning the need for the incinerator, its location, its size, its cost, the potential liability on the taxpayer, the mismanagement of the project. We went through a lot of those points when you were in the front of the committee previously. I'm not going to go back over them again, but only this year did we finally start to get proper light on the project in terms of the money being spent and where it's being spent. We got the actual details of the costs. Now we know today that over 80 million has been spent to date and still nothing has been built, and there's been overruns in practically every area of the project. We now have the audit report from local government, and it's pretty damning, but still the project is going ahead. So what I would like to do, without going back over previous ground from our last committee meeting, is to go through the audit report and to get your opinion on the different elements that are raised in it. So I might just initially turn then to page 17 of that report, and this is the Local Government Audit Service year ended 31st December 2011, and it's Appendix 1, review of expenditure to the 31st December 2012 on the thermal treatment plant. Page 17 then, paragraph 2. So I'm just going to read out some elements of this first paragraph. Financial management as part of project management by the Environment and Engineering Department for this project has been weak. No proper classification of expenditure on an invoice basis was available to account for money spent on this project at the initial audit stage, which was April 2012. There is no evidence of monitoring of detailed budgets or financial forecasts. It is also noted that the project executive board did not meet on a formal basis, and therefore no minutes of meetings were retained. What do you make of this audit report on the Poolbeg Incinerator?
I'm concerned by this audit report on the Poolbeg Incinerator. It's an important piece of work and a necessary piece of work in terms of the costs incurred to date. I've received it recently. It's been the subject of very recent discussion at Dublin City Council on Monday evening. On Tuesday, after that City Council meeting, I invited the City Manager in to give his view to me and to hear my views on this report. And I'm aware of the process that Dublin City Council are now putting in place in relation to it. But I have said I am concerned by it, and I am concerned to be fully kept abreast of further assessment, which will be carried out within the City Council, and the responses that management will make to the City Councillors on it. I understand that the report will be the subject of discussion at the Dublin City Council Audit Committee today, and there is an intention to have a full and detailed Audit Committee meeting on the report in January, and that's the proper, if you like, that's the direct accountability as far as this is concerned.
When you talk about direct accountability, public representatives for this area and this constituency, it's been like pulling teeth out of officials, because we've seen the finances escalating. over a decade to more than 80 million, nothing actually being built. I'm going to go through in a moment the client representative costs and the detailed breakdown that you provided us a couple of months ago. All the while, officials, both in the City Council and in the Department of Environment, acting like there has been nothing wrong and nothing to investigate. In fact, the words you used yourself the last time in front of us, there's nothing to investigate here, when clearly there has been something to investigate. And we look about accountability. This is a project that no elected representative for the area is actually in favour of. And I'm actually interested to hear that you had the manager in, because my understanding was that the manager didn't report to you on this issue. Previously, when we talked about it, you said that you had a member on the, is it the Project Executive Board?
Project Advisory Board.
Advisory Board. I take it that that met on a formal basis, because the Project Executive Board did not.
Yes, it did.
It did. Now, you understand the concern I'm raising here in terms of where the actual accountability lies. You've mentioned a process underway in Dublin City Council, but the councillors in Dublin City Council have been trying to stop this project since it began. So,
at the same time, Deputy, I would have to put some emphasis on the fact that this project arises out of the Dublin Regional Waste Management Plan, which is a plan of the Dublin authorities, adopted by the Dublin authorities.
yes, it is. But the problems that are laid out by this audit report, who takes the responsibility for those?
The city management.
City manager. It's the city manager's responsibility. But ultimately, he is responsible to somebody.
He's responsible to his elected members.
The city manager.
Yes.
And who's the city manager elected by?
I beg your pardon?
Sorry, the city manager.
The city manager is ultimately accountable to the elected members of Dublin City Council.
But the Dublin City Council members have no responsibility when it comes to waste management. That's always been the problem here. Even though the councillors voted against this incinerator ever getting off the ground, it still went ahead because the city manager and his officials wanted it to. So he's not actually held accountable or responsible to the city councillors and Dublin City Council. And yet you called him into your office this week. So is he accountable or responsible to you?
He's not accountable or responsible to me for what he does in this regard. No, he's responsible and accountable to the elected members of Dublin City Council. This is not an Exchequer-funded project. It's a PPP private project.
But Exchequer money has gone into it from the Department of Environment, some 8 or 9 million.
Yes.
Yes, so it is Exchequer funded in
Period.
part.
Exchequer funded to the extent of roughly 7.5 million of a grant provided in the period 2001 to 2005 for the initial part of the client representative costs.
Yes.
There is no project funding for this project from the Exchequer or from the department.
Well, there is, because the money that's been spent is taxpayers' money. And Exchequer money did come in from the department initially. So it is tied up in the 80 million plus costs that have been spent.
The Exchequer money which came in supported by Cohesion Fund was in relation to the contract for the client representative.
Which was a part of the incinerator project. I mean, it's a breakdown and part of the costs that you provided me yourself, the client representative costs. So, of course, it's a part of the project. And that's Exchequer funding. And that's come from your department. So you have a responsibility there in terms of that money. But also because the local audit office comes from your department and they've done this audit, you have a responsibility, I suppose, for the contents in the report. And you have a further responsibility with the manager, it seems, because you called him into your office to discuss it.
I wouldn't like to give you the impression that I'm shirking responsibility here, because that is not the case. I've identified and I've said to you that I am concerned by the findings of this report. This report is new and recent, and we are absorbing it. But at the same time, the position, as I have outlined it to your colleague, Deputy, is that local authority management is responsible to the elected members of the local authority, and the local government audit service reports to the elected members of the local authority. You say the elected members have no responsibility in relation to this project, but they absolutely have responsibility because they vote money. They're the people who determine the budget for Dublin City Council on an annual basis. This is spent from Dublin City Council's budget. It is absolutely the job of the Dublin City Council elected members and their audit committee to assess this and to raise questions or to address it as they see fit.
I'm not saying it's
and
not.
I understand now that they have set out a process through their audit committee under which they will do that, and that is absolutely correct and appropriate. I have lots of interests with all local authorities in the area of waste management because of the responsibility we have for waste management policy and waste management legislation, and the ownership we have of community legislation and our obligations at EU level in terms of our performance under the Waste Framework Directive. So there are lots of reasons why I would be talking to any individual local authority or specific local authorities in the waste area. But at the same time, there are very direct accountabilities within local government for spend and for the application of policy in specific circumstances and for the adoption of policy within a local authority, and they are being properly exercised in the Dublin City Council situation.
This isn't any other particular project. It's been a political hot potato since it began, and we've discussed it in committee before. It's been an issue for previous ministers. It's an issue for this minister. Again, I'm not talking about policy. I'm talking about the actual project implementation itself, of which we have committed money from the Exchequer, but from the department and through the department to local government, excuse me, from taxpayers through the local authority, and we also have a representative involved in some way in the project as well, and you have taken a keen interest in it. I haven't said this isn't the responsibility for councillors in Dublin City Council. I haven't said they haven't got a role in addressing this issue. And I'm not claiming that anyone's trying to shirk responsibility. Part of my problem here, as I outlined it before, is that I don't know who has responsibility here. And I asked you before, when you were before us, how much money can the city manager spend on this before he's told to stop? And where does that point end? I mean, we have here that the financial management of this project has been weak, and the governance has been weak. And we've had this chair ourselves with another authority that came before us. At that time, we were looking at legacy issues 5 to 6 years previous, and we were trying to get to them. We're now looking at something that's actually active in our time while this committee sits, and money is still being spent. And in terms of the city manager's response, which I'm going to come to because it's in the audit report as well, they're going to now continue to spend money on things like client representative costs. And I find that very worrying. But what I want to do now, if I may, is just go through some of those details and try and get a better idea perhaps where the city manager's coming from, seeing as you've spoken to him on that point.
Can I just ask one question to clarify? If the members decided tomorrow morning not to spend any more money, they just have to vote against it. Is that it?
That will be a matter for the members.
No, I'm asking about the process. I understand who it is a matter for. If they decided that they were not going to fund this anymore, I'm just following up on the information you gave, Deputy Murphy. It's then a matter for the members to make that decision. So if the manager puts before them a plan to spend X amount on this project, again, the members can exercise their vote to support it or not to support it. That's the question, Deputy, because you said earlier on that the members were against this or they wanted to stop this project. Well, in fact, according to what the Secretary-General is saying, that it is in their hands whether the manager spends more money on this or not, is how I understand it. I just want to clarify that. And therefore, they decide yes or no by voting on his estimate.
Well, that's interesting. That's not how I understood it. I always understood that waste... thank you. I always understood that waste management was an executive function and didn't fall to the members, including in terms of how the money was spent on waste management. I don't understand that. I don't know. I'm not... Yeah, no, thank you, but I'm not...
Dublin City Council have had their budget meeting for 2013. Dublin City Council have adopted their estimates for 2013. I don't know, I haven't seen their estimate for 2013. That's a function of Dublin City Council. I don't know how detailed the figures are, or whether you can trace down to individual projects, but that is a matter for the Dublin elected members, to question their management in the context of the adoption of a budget for 2013.
Absolutely. It's also a matter for us, though. Do you accept that?
I'm not sure
I mean,
that I
this
accept
commissions the local government audit service, your department, and this is an appendix to that report, or an annex, sorry, or no, appendix 1. So there must be responsibility of your department for this. I mean, apart from the fact that you've spent money on it, you've also commissioned an audit and it's come back and it's pretty damning. So there must be, and you've called the city manager in. So there is responsibility in your department. If there wasn't, you wouldn't have called him in.
It's a matter of great public interest for a whole variety of reasons. This particular plant is a very significant plant in terms of our future capacity to comply with waste legislation. So we have an interest in it in terms of waste policy at a broad level. We have an interest in it in terms of its, I suppose, compliance with our new waste policy, a resource opportunity. It's of concern to us in that sort of broad policy context. But if I come back to the very specific questions that you're raising, this is a plant within a regional management plan adopted by the elected members of Dublin City Council. Yes, it is a matter for the executive of Dublin City Council to proceed with the implementation of the elements of the Regional Waste Management Plan. And yes, it is a matter for the elected members of Dublin City Council to oversee, supervise and require its management to account to it for the implementation of a plan which they adopted. It's also a matter for Dublin City Council to hold the manager and the management to account for the spending of money which they have adopted as part of their estimate.
But it's not a matter for the Department of Environment.
The Local Government Audit Service provides, if you like, the technical and professional support for the City Council to enable them and assist them to question in the same way as the CNAG provides the evidence for this committee to question accounting officers in terms of the discharge of their functions.
Now, when the CNAG does that with accounting officers here, it's a matter for us, we discuss it. So when the local authority audit service does it for you in your department with what's happening in local government spend, it's
as
a matter
I've said
for
to you, the local government audit service does it for the elected members of the local authority.
Your department. It's out of your department, that service. I mean, it's under your responsibility.
Yes.
I mean, there's staff in your department, the salaries are paid, the lines of management there. Yes.
But legislation provides that it's absolutely independent in the performance of its audit functions. So they do not answer to me.
But they report back to you?
They report to the elected members of the local authority.
Did you get a report?
We have an interest in the health, the financial health of the local government system, a very big interest, obviously, and as we've discussed here, lots of exchequer money flows through local government, so we have a considerable interest in the local government system, yes. All local government audit reports come to us. All local government audit reports are placed on our website. The Local Government Audit Service provides a composite annual report, an activity report, and that activity report in the Local Government Audit Service is sent to the Oireachtas Committee on Environment, Community and Local Government. So there is, yes, a relationship, but in formal terms, in the specifics of accountability, this project...
The audit report goes to the Environment Committee here in the Oireachtas.
Yeah. The activity report, the broad activity report.
Would then maybe perhaps question you on it as well, and you would answer questions on what was in the audit reports.
The local government auditor has attended on one occasion.
So they can do that, and I presume we can do so here. I mean, you seem to be outlining that you've got an interest but not a responsibility. An interest in the project, an interest in the financial management, an interest in the governance, but not a responsibility. If the city manager had refused to come into your office, would that have been acceptable?
Sorry, I beg your pardon?
If the city manager had refused, when you asked him to come into your office to speak to you about this audit report, could he have refused?
I'd be very surprised if that, should that happen.
No, but I mean, could he have? I mean, is there any kind of a chart somewhere or a piece of legislation that says he reports to you in any regard whatsoever?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I've never actually had occasion to ask myself in legislation, is there a formal piece of, a formal obligation? But there is a general obligation in local government legislation for local authorities to provide any information to the Minister, which the Minister requests. And in those circumstances, I think, we take the view that providing information to the Department is covered by the general requirement or the general obligation on local authorities to provide information to the Minister.
Okay, I'll move on from the responsibility point, and I want to get into a bit of the detail of the audit report, if I may. On the same page, page 17, the second paragraph, it talks about the total paid to the client representative, amounts to 28.4 million, including PR costs, compared to the original contract for 8.3 million. The continued appointment of the client representative should have been reviewed as far back as 2005 in accordance with procurement guidelines. So procurement guidelines were breached, as well as a significant budget overrun at the time. Now, you paid some money from the Department of Environment directly in for client representative costs, as you confirmed just earlier. So there is a direct interest there and responsibility. And what I'm wondering is whether or not your department at any stage asked about that increase in money being spent, or whether or not the procurement guidelines were being followed at the time.
At the time we paid, we agreed to pay money on the basis of a specific contract amount in 2001, and we paid in the period on an instalment basis in the period 2001 to 2005. We made it very clear that the grant provided at the time related to the contract amount at that point, and that the department was not in a position to and would not be providing any further financial support for client rep costs. The support related to pre-planning study by the and early activity by the client rep. So we didn't have any involvement post 2005.
It's amazing because when you see the different things that come up in different departments. We had the Department of Defence in here before, Chair, in relation to the Red Cross, talking about this public money that the department spent there for the Red Cross. And they said, well, we spend our money, we make sure our money is spent correctly, and what they do with the rest of it, that they raise off the back of it, and other public money, we don't care. We spend our bit, we look after that, and there we go. And here it is, we have it again. You spend your 8 to 9 million from the Exchequer, you make sure that that was spent on what you said it was spent on, and then you don't worry about it anymore. But the problem with that is the project continued after you had spent your money. And you still had, I think, a responsibility, being the Department of Environment, responsible for local government. As costs continued to go out of control. In 2005, when your particular contract ended, that's exactly when, according to the audit report, there should have been a review in accordance with procurement guidelines as to the client representative that was being engaged and the costs that were being spent, and yet it didn't happen. And the department didn't care, I suppose. Is that the right word to use?
No, I don't think. I'm not sure that that's a reasonable or a realistic comment to make. The department has been concerned about this project in broad waste policy terms for a long period of time, but we don't have management ownership of the project. Management ownership of the project rests with Dublin City management.
How many times have you called in the city manager into your office to discuss this particular project?
This particular project would have been discussed on quite a number of occasions over the last 5-6 years of my tenure in the department. I couldn't tell you, to be perfectly honest, how many times it would have come up in discussion, because it's a large and active area of waste policy. But I would have discussed it in a waste policy context rather than specifically in the specific management of this project.
So I suppose that actually, you were in here, I think, previously in March of this year, and we spent almost an hour talking about the Poolbeg project. Not about the policy, but about the project itself and how the money had been spent and cost overruns. Had you spoken with him since then about the actual project and how it was being implemented and how the money was being spent and whether the right checks and balances were in place, or any of those types of issues?
We have spoken on a number of occasions in the intervening time because I have provided further information to the committee requested, and that is information which I can only source from Dublin City Council because, as I said, it is not a project now being funded as part of a public capital programme. We don't have any ownership, we don't have any responsibility or approval process associated with
significant
it.
interests. Enough so that you would look into the details now. And I suppose what I'm asking then is, prior to 2012, would you have been having conversations with the city manager, not on the policy aspect of this project, but on the details of the project itself and its implementation?
Not really, no. No. I would regard that as a matter for Dublin City Council.
Even as costs continued, I mean, a 20 million jump just between 2005 and 2007, the 2 different years that value for money reports were done. But then, even when you thought the 7 million you'd invested, or the, sorry, 7 8 million you'd invested in the project, being like a drop in the ocean, less than 10% of the actual costs coming up to the beginning of 2012.
I'm not sure that you're correct in referring to those reports as value for money reports. Those reports were undertaken as part of the assessment of the PPP competition. The first one relates to the assessment of the tender provided by the private operator. Subsequent to that, the contract was awarded to LSAM, and subsequent to that, there was a corporate restructuring involved here, where the company awarded the contract was taken over by a different company, and there was a corporate restructuring within the takeover process. And again, we went back. I think the Dublin City Council was required to go back under PPP, capital appraisal and PPP guidelines to establish whether this corporate takeover constituted a continuation of the contract or a basis upon which a new procurement was required. So it was a public sector benchmark study as opposed to a VFM study in those cases.
The NDFA chief executive said to the city manager, John Tierney, that it was a value for money report. And he said that in a letter dated June 2007. So are there different types of value for money reports? I mean, maybe there are, but I have it here. That's what he said. So, and he described it as a value for money report. It was provided with a number of different reports from the chief executive, of the NDFA to the city manager in 2007.
Perhaps I could ask my colleague Ronan Mulhall, who has been involved with this and involved with the project advisory board to comment, because those reports were carried out in the context of the specific, firstly, the tender award, as I've said, and secondly, the tender consortium reconfiguration.
Sorry, Deputy and Chair. I suppose it touches on some of the points made earlier. What the NDFA provide is that the proposed approach via PPP represents value for money when compared to a public sector benchmark. So that's, if that helps in terms of
point, sorry.
What it is the NDFA look at the proposed PPP approach against a public sector benchmark to go more the traditional route, and does it represent value for money to go this route. And in 2007, the review in 2007 would have been to see that the corporate restructuring did nothing to change its initial view, which was done at the earlier stage.
I understand the distinction you're making, but I'm not sure the relevance of the point, because to decide which option A or B represents better value for money, you've got to look at both options and how the money is going to be spent and what the value is and the different aspects of it. And that would involve then looking into these different aspects. And in 2007, when it was done again after 2005, at that stage the project had already cost almost 50 million and nothing had been built.
Again, it would be looking at it over the project's lifetime. So, for example, it would be, and NDFA probably better placed to explain their methodology, but essentially they would be coming to a cost for the entire project over its lifetime, finding some form of benchmark over the project's lifetime, including its operational lifetime, and saying that would equate to X, and then comparing that to the proposed project agreement and PPP arrangement with the private partner.
Excuse me, Mr. McCarthy wants to come in, and some of the issues that you're raising can be taken up again next week in terms of the NDA.
Yes, Deputy. I think you're probably touching on a distinction between the appraisal of the project as to whether building an incinerator is the optimum way from an economic point of view to deal with waste, or and the value for what's called the value for money test that's carried out by NDFA is one around what is the best way to procure it. And there is quite a distinction between the two things. As you say, if a project is undertaken on the basis that capital costs will be, let's say, 100 million, but then with the elapse of time it turns out that it's going to be 160 million, you obviously need to go back and revisit the economic case for the project separately from deciding, once we've decided that it is still worth doing the project, then you can revisit the question of, is it better to do it by conventional procurement or by a PPP route? So that there are two issues in there.
Thank you. That's actually very helpful, and it brings me on to the next point I wanted to raise, and it's related to it, Ms. Tallon, is in terms of the Hennessy report that was commissioned by a previous minister. How were none of these issues raised in the Hennessy report? How did they not come to light through that report? That looked at the lifetime of the project, the economic benefits, the impact, and everything else.
The Hennessy report had a very specific set of terms of reference, and it worked within those terms of reference. And it was really based around a number of scenarios for waste growth and waste diversion in the Dublin region. Again, it wasn't a value for money type study. It was a study against the background of the issue of the quantum of waste in the Dublin region and the possibility or the prospect that policy decisions or policy instruments for the diversion of waste or to favour alternative forms of waste technologies or waste solutions could have implications for the plant. So it looked at and identified a series of scenarios within which the plant's, financial framework could be affected.
It didn't look at all in terms of how money was spent previously.
No, it didn't. You're aware of what the Hennessy report is. It's published with.
I know, and I have seen it. But again, previously we discussed the Hennessy report and whether or not it was worth the time and money, and it was difficult to come to an actual conclusion on that point, if I remember correctly. But it seems to not have been worth it at this stage.
For a different purpose.
Yeah, I know, and it doesn't suit our purpose today, unfortunately. In terms of then continuing with the audit report and continuing on the issue of client representative costs, we received correspondence from your department on 30th of May 2012. It is going back a bit, but it was a breakdown of costs incurred on the Poolbeg waste energy project, and it went into some detail in relation to the different costs. And I remember we discussed it at the time, Chair, in correspondence, and I stated how it actually raised more questions than it did answer them. Now, I'm sure you saw this correspondence before it issued, but I know you won't remember it now. I have a copy in front of me. But just to go through a couple of the points in that, because while the audit report talks about money spent, it doesn't maybe question enough of the areas in enough detail that I would like. For example, under number 1, client representative costs, it gives a bulleted list. Preparation of various reports, including PPP assessment, procurement of a design model, development and implementation of a public consultation and information strategy was one of the bulleted points under client representative costs. Yet in that correspondence you sent to us, if you go to then point 6, stakeholder consultation / public relations, and it talks about other costs of public awareness, other consultancy, design, market soundings, costs of public awareness office in Ringsend. So when I see the bill for 25 million for client representative costs under one heading, and I see it talks about public consultation and information strategy, and I see a separate bill for just over 4 million where it's doing all of those things, I'm concerned, because I'm wondering then about duplication. I'm wondering about this project being seen as a potential cash cow by certain people. They could just go in and get money for all sorts of things without properly explaining themselves. Do you have a, you don't have a, happen to have a copy of this correspondence to hand? Do you? Okay, fantastic, thank you. When you sent this correspondence to the committee, I mean, did you have a discussion around it before it was sent to us as to the different items that were detailed? Did you discuss it with the manager at the time, perhaps? Did anyone in the department look at it in detail and raise some questions? For example, number 2, other consultancy. Dublin Waste to Energy Limited was paid 1 million in other consultancy, and yet Dublin City Council is part of the Dublin Waste to Energy Consortium.
This is information which we provided to the committee from Dublin City Council. It's not information generated in the department, and it's not information on which the department carried out any particular assessment with Dublin City Council.
Did it concern you, the information that you got from Dublin City Council at that time, before you sent it on to us? Did it concern you?
This was a categorisation done by the City Council, and it's their responsibility. In broad terms, yes, I'm concerned by the findings of the audit report, and it is a concern that so much has been spent or has had to be spent on this project before the project has come to construction. But again, I have to say, this is a responsibility of Dublin City management.
Page 19, paragraph 5 of the local audit report. Dublin City Council paid Dublin Port Company 8.5 million for their interest in the Pigeon House Road / Shellybanks Road site under a compulsory purchase order in September 2011. In terms of the valuation on the land for that CPO, was that valuation from 2011 or was it from a previous date?
You're asking me operational matters from Dublin City Council, and I can't give you an answer.
I know. Unfortunately, I asked them when you were at last in front of us about when the CPOs were issued and when the actual prices were paid, and on what value they were paid in terms of when the valuation was determined.
I told you the valuation at the time of the service of notice to treat is the valuation is the basis for payment in a CPO context.
Yeah, and we discussed that around the 2007 CPO, but not the one that was meant to issue in 2010, although according to this, it actually took place in September 2011. But you did, at the time, say you would follow up on that point. I raised a number of points. I would very much appreciate it if I could get some detailed information on the CPO process with the lands in question here, as to what prices were paid and when those valuations were made for the prices that were paid.
I expect that all of the detail of this report will now be examined considerably.
Oh no, but this detail is in
considerable detail, further detail by the Dublin City Council Audit Committee, and I have asked the manager to give me a report when he has the outcome from the Audit Committee, and until that, there isn't very much more that I can provide with you, Deputy. I expect Dublin City Council Audit Committee to do this job in a forensic way now. That is their role and function. And in a sense, you're involving this committee in a parallel process.
Well, I think it's a necessary process.
What's the time frame on that report, Mr. Masal? When are you expecting that report?
I understand that the Dublin City Council Audit Committee are meeting with the local government auditor today for a general review of the audit, and that a date in late January has been set for a full and detailed assessment of this particular part of the audit report, and there will be a report following that meeting.
Are you likely to get that report?
I hope I'll get it in the first quarter of next year. I would expect to get that.
And
that's the point at which I will have, I hope, the considered view.
At that stage, Deputy, when the report is available, we can have a look at it here.
No, I absolutely accept that, Chair, and I accept the position that you're in, Ms. Dallin. But I won't raise any more specific points in relation to the audit report. because I accept the point that you're making, but I'll make a couple of points just to conclude. The deadline for this project has been extended time and time again because the private partner in it cannot find the financing, and because there's been other problems at our end in terms of foreshore licenses and everything else. When you were with us previously, you told us that we'd have the report from the local audit unit after the summer. And we knew that the August was the deadline for the final extension of the contract. We now know that it's been extended yet again into the first quarter of next year. And you're coming to us today and you're saying, yes, we're looking at it. Now I am concerned. We have an interest, but not really a responsibility. And the first quarter of next year, I'll come back to you with more details. And my concern, Chair, is that this project is running away from us like a freight train towards a cliff. People are trying to stop it, and it seems to be out of control. And so we do need, as a Public Accounts Committee, to have a proper handle on this. Because as you said before in this meeting and in the previous meeting, excuse me, it is a significant project. It's not just any other project undertaken by a local authority. And that's why, sorry, I beg your pardon, that's why we need to be fully appraised of all the details as they come in. And yes, the councils have responsibility in this, of course they do, but I believe that we do as well, given exchequer funding that was committed, and given taxpayers' money that has been committed, and given central money from the environment, from the government to the local authorities that is continually committed, and further funding that will come from taxpayers and new charges that are being levied, that'll be committed. So just to conclude on the audit report, and because you mentioned that the city manager was in with you on Tuesday, the manager's given his response in the audit report to the issues that have been raised, and that's on page 21 and 22. And he begins in his response, and I'll be fair to the city manager, Dublin city manager, he's not here to answer himself. But I just wanted to note a couple of things. I don't expect you to answer for either, Secretary General, but the first paragraph, the waste to energy project has proved extremely challenging, indeed more challenging than other controversial projects that the Environment and Engineering Department has been involved in, such as the Regional Wastewater Treatment Plant. The Regional Wastewater Treatment Plant is the Ringsend Wastewater Treatment Plant that has gone over time, over budget by more than 40 million, has caused a significant imposition in constituents in the same constituency. And here we have in black and white that it's been run by the exact same section of Dublin City Council. Two projects, they're both very significant for the Dublin region. In fact, the incinerator, as we know from the private partners, it's not just for Dublin, it's for the country as a whole. And they're having massive problems with both of them. And you, as Secretary General of the Department of the Environment, has a huge interest in both these projects because, as you know, in terms of EU directives, if we don't comply with certain guidelines or directives from Europe, we're going to come into significant fines, and that's an issue certainly for you and certainly for the Minister. What do you make of that? That we have the same section in the same city council that is having massive problems with two significant projects. At what point does the Minister or Secretary General go, okay, we're stepping in, this is no longer your responsibility because you're not handling it properly?
These are two very different situations, Deputy and Chairman. I have a considerable interest in the Ringsend wastewater treatment plant and a considerable accountability for the spend in relation to the wastewater treatment plant because it is part of the public capital programme for wastewater. And I'm reasonably familiar, I'm not up to exact speed at the moment, but I am fairly familiar with the background and the issues as far as the Ringsend wastewater treatment plant is concerned, and there were a specific set of issues related to the design and the capacity and the overloading in that plant and the need for further treatment, etc. It's quite separate. It wouldn't, I think, be fair to compare these two and say that automatically, because there were problems with Ringsend and because there is difficulty in the Poolbeg Incinerator, that you automatically conclude that there is serious fault within the management in Dublin City Council.
Of the exact same local authority, consider the exact same area of the country, the Poolbeg Peninsula. Both projects are in the exact same place, in the same department and the same local authority, and that doesn't concern you?
They're very, very different.
They're very different projects, but surely that must concern you. These are two massive problems for Dublin City Council, and they have been since before I became involved in politics, and they still are. This isn't a coincidence. Both projects have been run out of the same department of the same council for the same area.
Very different projects, and
Incinerator was a wastewater treatment plant. I know the different projects.
very different considerations in each case. As I started by saying, I am concerned about this report. I am concerned about the findings. I am concerned by the manager's response, and I have made clear that I expect to see a thorough assessment by the Dublin Audit Committee, and I expect to see a further response from the Dublin City Manager. And the Dublin City Manager did give, I think, an initial response at a fairly broad level, but at a sufficient level nonetheless. At this point, the City Manager gave some detailed response to the City Council on Monday night, and again, that's where the accountability lies in taking this forward.
I believe it.
We've given it a fair hearing.
Just two more points, Chair.
And we have to be out here by 12:30.
So I've just two more points if I can. Thank you. Ms. Allen, I appreciate your concern, absolutely. My problem is that that concern hasn't been there before, because these amounts of money and these problems in financial and governance weaknesses didn't just come out of the air. They've always been there. And just to make 2 points in the City Manager's response, 2 final points. It's my interpretation of the response that when he talks about the delays and why the client representative costs overran, that there seems to be a blame being put on the fact that there was public scrutiny over the project. That's my interpretation. I'm not asking you to comment on it, and I don't accept that if that's the case. But what I do find alarming is the second last paragraph. It's on page 22. Arrangements have now been put in place to engage separate client representative services for the construction and commissioning phase of the project. Client representative services that have overrun 200% to date. Client representative services that are in breach of the procurement guidelines already. And client representative services for a project that no one in the area, elected or unelected, thinks should be happening, and to date has been run appallingly. And at the moment, there is no private financing for. And again, Chair makes a point, the money is being spent, and it's being spent right now. And this is the manager saying to, as a response to this audit report, we're going to continue to spend money on client representative services, which is only a part of the project. It's not even the build, you know. It's incredibly frustrating as I sit here on the Public Accounts Committee. And I just wanted to make that point because, Chair, I do believe that we have a responsibility here. Ms. Talon, I do believe that you have a responsibility as well. I know you said you have concern, you have an interest. I believe you have a responsibility also. And I do think the Public Accounts Committee has to keep this project on its radar right up until its conclusion, and hopefully it's finally put to bed. I know there's a tendency with public money to not admit that you've spent bad money. But we certainly shouldn't be putting good money after bad money here. I'll conclude on that point, Chair.
Okay, I'll just, may I just by way of wrapping up that part of the meeting, say to you that while Deputy Murphy took the questions and you very kindly went into detail with him, that it is a concern that is shared by other members of the committee, and it certainly is a concern that is shared by me. So because of the exchange, and it's on a one-to-one with Deputy Murphy, you should not think that it is just Deputy Murphy. It is a concern for the Public Accounts Committee. I think that the report that you speak about is important for us to see. We will, as Deputy Murphy has asked, keep it on the radar on the Public Accounts Committee. It is a concern that that level of money is being spent, and I could go into detail in terms of the report that's before us, but I think that you've given a fair hearing and time to this, and we will come back to this again. So when you have the report available, you might make it available to us, but using Deputy Murphy's words, it is something, a project that will be kept on the radar of the work of this committee. I have a whole series of questions here. It's too late.